My name is Jaslyn Johnson, and this is my mitochondrial DNA case analysis. So a little bit about YSTRs and mitochondrial DNA in forensic cases. So the YSTRs are found only on the Y chromosome, so it's used directly to identify male suspects. It allows for the analysis of male DNA even when there's a mixture present that contains both male and female DNA. It's still able to differentiate between the two and determine which DNA belongs to the male. And all males in the same parental line share the same YSTR. So this makes it difficult to differentiate between two individuals, say siblings or something, but it can determine the presence of male DNA. Mitochondrial DNA has many copies per cell, like hundreds of thousands of copies per cell, which allows for it to work on degraded samples that have sat for a long time or samples where not much of the sample was able to be collected and it was more limited. So this is best for cold cases where the samples have sat for a long time, or disaster cases where most of it has been destroyed and not much of it was able to be collected. And then for mitochondrial DNA, it is inherited from the mother. So those who share the same maternal line will have the same mitochondrial DNA. And this information was gathered by the textbook. So why is mitochondrial DNA useful? So it is able to work even when the nuclear DNA fails. So when there's no nuclear DNA present, you can use this mitochondrial DNA. It's effective on hair shafts, bones, and teeth that do not have this nuclear DNA. And this is because mitochondria contain their own DNA that differs from the DNA that is in the nucleus. And this information came from the case file written by Davis. And so the DNA in the mitochondria is a lot smaller than the DNA in the nucleus, and it is inherited directly from the mother and contains many copies per cell. This also came from the case file written by Davis. But a major limitation of mitochondrial DNA is it cannot distinguish between relatives within the same maternal line. So this makes it difficult to determine the difference between like two siblings' DNA or people who share the same mother. And this information came from the textbook. So a little bit of the case overview. I chose a case, the state of Tennessee versus Paul Ware. So this was a case where 27-year-old Paul Ware was a suspect in a sexual assault and murder case involving a 4-year-old girl. And so Ware was stating that the babysitter framed him, and he was found drunk and asleep next to the 4-year-old girl. However, upon searching for evidence, a small red hair was found in the throat of the victim as well as on the bed in the sheets. And so the mitochondrial DNA was extracted from his saliva and the victim's blood for comparison to see who those hairs belonged to. Other than this, all other evidence was pretty circumstantial, so this DNA evidence is pretty crucial. All of this information came from the case file written by Davis. So why didn't they use the traditional STR method? So the hairs that were collected were telogen shafts, which lacked the hair root, so there was no nuclear DNA present, and there was no blood found on Ware, and no semen was found on the 4-year-old girl either. So this made the traditional STR analysis nearly impossible due to the lack of nuclear DNA. And this information also came from the case file written by Davis. So a little bit about the mitochondrial DNA analysis that was performed. So the mitochondrial DNA was extracted from the hairs that were found in the throat of the victim as well as the hairs found in the bed sheets. And then they also extracted mitochondrial DNA from Paul Ware's saliva and the victim's blood for comparison. And at this time, the FBI database only had 742 individuals in there with mitochondrial DNA. However, Paul Ware's did not match any of the previous searches. This information also came from the case file written by Davis. So the outcome of the case, the hairs found in the throat and the bed, the mitochondrial DNA was extracted and compared to one another, and they were found to be an exact match. So the hairs matched up and were from the same person. So then the mitochondrial DNA of these hair samples were compared to the victim's blood sample, and they did not match the 4-year-old girl's blood sample. However, the mitochondrial DNA of the hair samples were compared to Paul Ware's saliva sample, and they were a direct match. And this led to Ware being convicted of first-degree murder and rape, and he was sentenced to life without parole. This information all came from the case file written by Davis. So a little bit about the impact and significance of this mitochondrial DNA. So this case occurred in 1996, and it was the first case where mitochondrial DNA was presented in the trial. So that was a pivotal moment in the forensic science world, because up until this DNA was introduced, everything else was pretty circumstantial, and there was no hard evidence to convict Paul Ware. And then this really opened the door for cold cases, missing person cases, or cases where there's a destruction of most of the DNA, because it showed that the mitochondrial DNA can be used in these cases to help come to a conclusion, even if, say, like a cold case was closed due to insufficient evidence. Now maybe the mitochondrial DNA can be tested and extracted. It did show the strengths and weaknesses of mitochondrial DNA, with the strength being the sensitivity due to the many copies that are present per cell. This makes it so that a very small sample can still be used and detected. However, the major limitation of mitochondrial DNA is within people who share the same mother, there is not a unique set of mitochondrial DNA, so it can be difficult to determine between two individuals that share the same mother. So in conclusion, the mitochondrial DNA was a crucial tool that was discovered when there is no nuclear DNA present, like in this case, and the traditional STR methods are not possible to be used. It also encouraged the use of multiple types of DNA analysis for forensic cases, so even if there is nuclear DNA present, then maybe the mitochondrial DNA test should also be used to help with this analysis. And it also changed how DNA evidence was looked at for future cases, as well as cold cases that have been sitting for a while. And here are my references.